November 15, 1947. Detective Frank Torino had kept Al Capone's secret for 16 years. The night he let the most wanted man in America walk out of a South Side warehouse to save his partner's life. 300 cops filled St. Bartholomew's for Captain O'Malley's funeral. Then Capone walked in, black suit, white carnation, carrying a leather briefcase with $500,000 cash. He walked straight to O'Malley's casket, placed the money on top, turned to face the entire precinct. What happened in the next 10 minutes became the most buried story in Chicago police history. The mayor held emergency meetings because of it. And for 30 years, when cops talked about that funeral, they always came back to this moment. The moment Capone opened his mouth. The moment every badge in that room realized they'd been protecting the wrong man. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. Frank's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon when Capone's voice cut through the cathedral silence. Gentlemen. The word echoed off stone walls like a gunshot. You're burying the wrong corpse. 300 badges shifted in their pews. Frank felt the collective intake of breath, the way the air itself seemed to tighten around them. Commissioner Brady's face went white as fresh snow. Deputy Chief Sullivan's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. But it was the look that passed between Mayor O'Dwyer and District Attorney Harrison in the front row that made Frank's blood turn to ice water. Recognition. They knew something. Capone stepped away from the casket, his polished shoes clicking against marble that had heard 1,000 prayers and twice as many lies. The money sat there, $500,000 in bundled hundreds, like an obscenity against the white silk lining where Mickey O'Malley lay in his dress blues. Mickey O'Malley was a good cop, Capone continued, his voice carrying that familiar rasp from too many cigars and too many secrets. Better than most of you deserve, which is why when I found out who really killed him, I figured his brothers in blue should know the truth. Frank's throat went dry. Killed him. The official report said heart attack, natural causes, clean death for a clean cop who'd put in his 30 and was 2 weeks from retirement. You're out of your goddamn mind, Capone. Commissioner Brady stood, his voice shaking with something that might have been rage or might have been fear. Mickey died of a heart attack. The coroner, Capone interrupted, pulling a manila envelope from his jacket, wrote what he was told to write, just like he did for Judge Morrison last month, and Senator Kellerman in August. Funny how many prominent men been having heart attacks lately. The envelope landed on O'Malley's chest with a soft thud. Frank could see photographs spilling out. Black and white images that caught the light from the stained glass windows. Detective Rose Murphy, sitting 2 rows behind Frank, made a sound like she'd been punched in the gut. She'd worked Morrison's death, ruled it natural causes without question. See, Mickey made a mistake, Capone said, his dead eyes scanning the crowd. He thought his old partner Frank here was the only dirty cop in this room. Thought he could trust the rest of you with what he'd learned about the North Side killings. About who's been cleaning house in this city. Frank's vision tunneled. Every cop in that cathedral was looking at him now. 300 pairs of eyes drilling into the back of his skull. Dirty cop. The words hung in the incense-thick air like a curse. But it was true, wasn't it? 16 years ago, he'd made a choice. Let Capone walk to save Mickey's life. Compromised everything he'd sworn to protect because his partner had 3 kids and a wife who made the best Sunday gravy on the South Side. Mickey came to see me last Tuesday, Capone continued. Scared as I'd ever seen him, said he'd figured out the pattern, said the corruption went higher than he'd imagined, said he had proof that would bring down half the city government and most of this precinct. Father Mackenzie stood at the altar like a statue, his prayer book forgotten in hands that trembled like autumn leaves. The old priest had buried cops before, too many, but never like this. Never with accusations flying over an open casket like bullets over no man's land. So I told him, Capone said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing every man in that room to lean forward. I told him the same thing I'm telling you now. In Chicago, the only difference between a cop and a criminal is the badge. And sometimes, not even that. Deputy Chief Sullivan was on his feet now, hand on his weapon. That's enough. Boys, arrest this son of a bitch. But nobody moved. Not one badge in that room reached for their cuffs or their gun. Because they all knew, every last one of them, that Capone wouldn't have walked into a room full of armed cops unless he held cards that trumped every weapon in the place. Frank found his voice, though it came out like broken glass. What proof? Capone smiled then, the first time Frank had seen that expression in 16 years. It was the same smile he'd worn that night in the warehouse, when Frank had stepped aside and let him disappear into the Chicago darkness. The kind of proof that gets good cops like Mickey killed, Capone said. The kind that explains why Judge Morrison was asking questions about missing evidence, why Senator Kellerman was demanding audits of police pension funds, why all these men who thought they could clean up this city wound up in caskets instead of courtrooms. He reached into his jacket again, slower this time, giving every nervous cop in the room a chance to see it wasn't a weapon. What he pulled out made Frank's knees buckle. A police evidence envelope, chain of custody signatures running down the side, and at the top, in Mickey O'Malley's careful handwriting, case hashtag 193147, warehouse incident, Det F. Torino, the night Frank's world had changed forever, the night that apparently never stopped haunting him. Introduction. Frank stared at that evidence envelope like it was a loaded gun pointed at his chest. Mickey's handwriting, careful, methodical Mickey who dotted every I and crossed every T, spelling out the night that had carved Frank's life into before and after. October 15th, 1931. The warehouse on Halsted Street where the Irish and Italian territories bled into each other like watercolors in the rain. Frank had been 31 then, still young enough to believe the badge meant something beyond the weight of metal on his chest, still foolish enough to think he could save everyone. The cathedral air tasted thick as molasses now, heavy with incense and the collective breath of 300 cops who'd gone statue still. Frank's shirt collar felt like a noose. 16 years of careful silence, of building a quiet life on the foundation of one terrible choice, crumbling like Chicago mortar in winter. You kept records, Frank said, the words scraping his throat raw. It wasn't a question. Mickey kept records, Capone corrected, tapping the envelope against his palm. Your partner was thorough, maybe too thorough for his own good. Behind Frank, Detective Rose Murphy shifted in her pew. Rose, who'd been Mickey's patrol partner before Frank made detective. Rose, who brought homemade cookies to the precinct every Christmas and remembered every cop's wife's birthday. Rose, who'd looked at Frank like he hung the moon for the past 16 years, never knowing she was staring at a man who'd let the city's most wanted criminals slip through his fingers. Frank thought about his apartment on Ashland Avenue. Third-floor walk-up, radiator that clanged like a ghost in chains, coffee pot that only worked if you hit it just right. 23 years he'd been coming home to those four walls, hanging his holster on the same hook by the door, washing the city's grime off his hands in the same chipped porcelain sink. It wasn't much of a life, but it was clean, quiet, safe, or it had been until this moment. What do you want, Capone? Commissioner Brady's voice cracked like ice over deep water. The man who'd given Frank his detective shield was sweating through his dress uniform, dark patches spreading under his arms like spilled ink. Capone's smile never wavered. I want the same thing Mickey wanted. The truth. He gestured toward the casket, toward the $500,000 that sat there like 30 pieces of silver. See, Mickey figured out something interesting about the evidence from that warehouse, about what really happened that night. Frank's mind raced back through the years, trying to remember what Mickey had seen, what he'd suspected. They'd been partners for 8 years by then, Frank the hothead, Mickey the steady hand, Mickey who'd taken 3 bullets meant for Frank, Mickey who'd bled out on that warehouse floor while Capone's men melted into the Chicago darkness like smoke. Frank had made his choice in that moment. Let Capone walk or watch his partner die while backup was still 10 minutes away. The math had been simple, brutal, final. He'd lived with that choice every day since, woke up to it, carried it through his shifts, fell asleep clutching it like a rosary of razor wire. The good cops he'd failed to arrest, the cases that went cold because he'd compromised himself, the slow poison of keeping secrets in a job that demanded truth. But Mickey had lived, married his sweetheart Mary, raised 3 kids who called Frank uncle, coached Little League on weekends, made captain before he turned 50, built the kind of life that made the choice seem worthwhile. Now Mickey was dead anyway, and Frank's sacrifice meant nothing. The warehouse records show some interesting inconsistencies, Capone continued, his voice carrying to the cathedral's furthest corners. Timing discrepancies, missing witness statements, evidence that disappeared from the lockup. His eyes found Frank's across the crowd, the kind of inconsistencies that suggest someone had help covering their tracks. Frank's hands started shaking. He pressed them against his thighs, feeling the worn fabric of his funeral suit, the same black wool he'd worn to his father's service, his mother's, too many brother officers over the years, the suit that marked endings, transitions, the moments when life pivoted on its axis and left you scrambling for purchase. Rose Murphy leaned forward, her breath warm against Frank's ear. "Frank, you okay?" Her voice carried genuine concern, the kind of worry that came from years of watching each other's backs. Rose, who'd been there the night Frank got shot chasing down a liquor store thief. Rose, who'd sat beside his hospital bed reading police reports aloud until he was cleared for duty. Rose, who trusted him completely. Rose, who was about to learn that trust was just another word for foolishness in a city built on lies. "I'm fine," Frank whispered back, the words tasting like ash. Because in about 30 seconds, when Capone opened that evidence envelope and spilled 16 years of buried truth across Mickey O'Malley's casket, Frank Torino's quiet life was going to end forever. Capone's fingers worked the envelope's metal clasp with the patience of a man who'd spent years in federal prison learning to savor small moments of control. The tiny clicking sound might as well have been thunder in the cathedral silence. Frank closed his eyes, but that only made it worse. Behind his lids, he could see that warehouse again, Mickey's blood spreading across concrete like spilled wine, the sound of Capone's shoes echoing as he walked away into freedom Frank had handed him on a silver platter. The envelope opened with a whisper of aged paper. October 15th, 1931, Capone read aloud, his voice carrying the cadence of a judge pronouncing sentence. Initial responding officers, Detective Francis Torino, Detective Michael O'Malley. Backup units, delayed due to radio malfunction. Frank's stomach dropped. Radio malfunction. That wasn't in any report he'd filed. The backup had been delayed because Frank never called it in, not until after Capone was gone, after he'd made his devil's bargain in that blood-soaked warehouse. Witnesses present, Capone continued, pulling out what looked like a photograph. 3 dock workers, 1 civilian. He held up the image, black and white and grainy, but clear enough. This civilian was particularly observant, had quite a lot to say about what he saw that night. Rose Murphy's hand found Frank's shoulder, squeezing tight. "Frank, what's he talking about?" But Frank couldn't answer, couldn't breathe, because he remembered that civilian now, an old man walking his dog who'd stumbled onto their stakeout. They'd sent him away, told him to forget what he'd seen. Standard procedure when civilians wandered into police business. Except this civilian had apparently talked to Mickey. Recently. "Mr. Giuseppe Castellano," Capone said, savoring each syllable like fine wine. 73 years old, retired longshoreman, lives in the boarding house on Taylor Street. Has a remarkable memory for details, especially conversations he overheard that night. The cathedral's stone walls seemed to press closer. Frank could feel 300 pairs of eyes boring into him, could hear the collective held breath of men who'd trusted him for 16 years. Commissioner Brady looked like he was going to be sick. Deputy Chief Sullivan's hand rested on his weapon, but his face showed the confusion of a man watching his world tilt sideways. "See, Mr. Castellano remembered hearing voices in that warehouse," Capone continued, pulling out what looked like a handwritten statement. "Detective voices having a very interesting conversation with a certain Italian gentleman about the health and well-being of wounded partners." Frank's vision grayed at the edges. The old man had heard everything. Every word of Frank's bargain with the devil, every promise to look the other way, every condition of the deal that had saved Mickey's life and damned Frank's soul. "Mickey went to see Mr. Castellano last week," Capone said, his dead eyes finding Frank's across the cathedral. "Brought him down to the station house. Got a sworn statement. Everything the old man remembered about that night, written down in black and white." The paper in Capone's hand looked like a death warrant. Frank could see Mickey's signature at the bottom, witnessed, notarized, official. His partner had known for God knew how long that Frank was dirty, that the foundation of their friendship was built on compromise and corruption. "But Mickey was a good man," Capone said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Loyal. He came to me first, before he took it to internal affairs. Wanted to give me a chance to explain, to make it right." Father Mackenzie swayed at the altar, his prayer book falling from nerveless fingers to clatter against marble. The sound echoed like breaking bones. "So I made him an offer," Capone continued. "The same offer I'm making now. The truth about who really runs this city, about who's been covering up murders and calling them heart attacks, about the network of corruption that goes so deep it would make your warehouse deal look like a parking ticket." Frank's mouth went dry as desert sand. "You killed him." "I tried to save him," Capone corrected. "Same way you tried to save him 16 years ago. But Mickey was stubborn. Said he'd taken an oath. Said some things mattered more than staying alive." The envelope hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Photographs scattered across the cathedral's marble. Crime scene photos, witness statements, police reports that Frank had never seen. Evidence of his corruption spread out like playing cards in a rigged game. Rose Murphy's hand fell away from his shoulder. When Frank turned, her face showed the exact moment trust died, the precise instant when 16 years of partnership crumbled into dust and bitter understanding. "Frank," she whispered, and his name in her mouth sounded like a curse. The old man's statement lay face up near Frank's feet, Mickey's careful handwriting visible in the margins. Notes, questions, a case file his partner had been building against him. Frank stared down at the wreckage of his life and realized there was no going back. The quiet apartment, the simple routine, the illusion of redemption, all of it was gone forever. In its place was only the truth he'd been running from for 16 years, the truth that had finally caught up, early development. Frank dropped to his knees on the cathedral's cold marble, gathering the scattered photographs with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Crime scene images, witness statements, police reports. 16 years of buried secrets bleeding across the floor in black and white. No. The word came out broken, desperate. "This isn't. Mickey wouldn't." But Giuseppe Castellano's statement stared up at him, every word a nail in his coffin. Detective offered to let the Italian walk if partner received medical attention. Italian agreed, said he'd remember the favor. Detective said he'd forget he ever saw anyone. Rose Murphy stood frozen behind him, her face a mask of dawning horror. Around them, 300 cops sat in stunned silence, watching Frank Torino, 30-year veteran, decorated detective, the man they'd called the most honest badge in Chicago, scrambled to hide evidence of his corruption like a common criminal. "Get up, Frank." Commissioner Brady's voice cut through the cathedral like a blade. "Get up and explain this." Frank's knees wouldn't work. His vision tunneled, reducing the world to scattered photographs and Mickey's careful handwriting documenting years of betrayal. He could fix this. Had to fix this. Maybe if he could gather all the evidence, find some way to explain. "I saved his life," Frank whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Mickey was bleeding out. The backup wasn't coming. I had to choose." "You chose wrong." Capone's voice drifted down from the altar like judgment from on high. "And you've been paying for it ever since. Question is, how many other people been paying with you?" Deputy Chief Sullivan moved closer, his footsteps echoing off stone walls. "Detective Torino, you need to stand up, now." But Frank couldn't stand, couldn't breathe. The cathedral air had turned thick as soup, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. Every face around him showed the same expression. Shock giving way to disgust, trust curdling into suspicion. These men who'd worked beside him, trusted him, called him friend. Rose Murphy's voice came from somewhere far away. "The Morrison case. You worked Morrison." Frank's head snapped up. "Judge Morrison, the heart attack victim from last month." Rose had caught that case, ruled it natural causes without question. But now her eyes held the terrible clarity of someone connecting dots she'd never wanted to see. "The evidence locker discrepancies," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The witness statements that went missing. The forensic reports that never made it to trial." Each word hit Frank like a physical blow. "How long, Frank? How long have you been cleaning up after them?" "I never," Frank started, but the words died in his throat. "Because it wasn't true, was it? 16 years of small compromises, files that disappeared, evidence that got lost, reports that never quite captured the whole truth, all in service of keeping Capone's secret, maintaining the balance that kept Mickey alive, keeping himself safe. Father Mackenzie had backed away from the altar, his face pale as communion wafers. The old priest pressed himself against the far wall, as if trying to disappear into the stone itself. Frank had seen that expression before, on witnesses who'd seen too much, on civilians caught between warring gangs, on anyone unlucky enough to glimpse the machinery that really ran Chicago. Fear, pure animal fear. "You see it now, don't you, Father?" Capone called to the priest. "See how deep this goes? Your good Detective Torino here. He's been playing both sides for 16 years. Irish mob needs a judge to disappear. Frank makes sure the evidence gets lost. Italian syndicate wants a politician silenced. Frank ensures the witness statements never reach trial. That's not true." Frank struggled to his feet, photographs scattering like confetti. I wouldn't." But even as he said it, the memories crashed over him. Judge Morrison asking too many questions about missing evidence, Senator Kellerman demanding audits, Police Captain Terry Walsh getting too close to the truth about syndicate operations. All dead now, all heart attacks, all natural causes, all cases that had crossed Frank's desk in some way. Commissioner Brady stepped closer, his hand resting on his weapon. "Detective Torino, you're under arrest for—" "For what?" Capone interrupted. "Doing what you all do? Playing the game the way this city taught him to play it?" His laugh echoed off cathedral walls like breaking glass. "Frank here isn't the disease, Commissioner. He's just a symptom." Rose Murphy's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "The warehouse records. Someone altered the warehouse records." She was staring at Frank with the intensity of a detective working a case, putting pieces together with terrible precision. The radio malfunction, the delayed backup, the missing witness statements, someone with access to evidence storage, someone with clearance to modify reports. Frank watched his old life die in Rose Murphy's eyes, saw the moment she stopped seeing a partner and started seeing a suspect. Around them, the cathedral had gone dead silent, except for the soft whisper of pages turning as cops pulled out notebooks, preparing to take statements, preparing to arrest him. The truth had finally caught up, and Frank Torino had nowhere left to run. The handcuffs clicked against Frank's wrists with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Commissioner Brady's hands trembled as he recited the Miranda rights. Words Frank had spoken 1,000 times himself, now turned against him like a weapon he'd forged with his own betrayal. "You have the right to remain silent." But silence was what had damned him. 16 years of keeping his mouth shut, of swallowing the truth until it poisoned everything he'd ever tried to protect. Frank stared at Mickey's casket, at the $500,000 still spread across the polished wood like blood money, and wondered if his partner had felt this same crushing weight before the heart attack took him. Before Capone's people gave him the heart attack. "The injections," Frank whispered, the words scraping his throat raw. "You killed them with injections, made it look natural." Capone's smile was winter cold. Air bubbles in the bloodstream, untraceable. Looks just like cardiac arrest to any coroner who isn't looking too hard. His dead eyes swept the cathedral. Amazing how many coroners in this city don't look too hard. Dr. Patricia Hayes from the medical examiner's office went white as altar cloth. She'd signed off on Morrison's autopsy, Kellerman's, Walsh's, a dozen others over the years, all ruled natural causes by a woman Frank had always considered beyond corruption. Now she stared at her hands like they belonged to someone else. "You made me an accomplice," she breathed. "Every report I filed, every death certificate I signed." "You signed what the evidence told you to sign," Capone replied. "Ain't your fault the evidence lied." Rose Murphy pushed through the crowd of paralyzed cops, her detective shield catching cathedral light like a star in the darkness. She knelt where the photographs had scattered, studying them with the methodical precision of someone building a case. Frank watched her face change as she processed each image, each document, each piece of evidence that Mickey had gathered before his death. 12 victims over 16 years, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. all connected to cases that crossed Detective Torino's desk, all killed when they got too close to syndicate operations. She looked up at Frank with eyes that had turned to ice. You fed them to him, fed them names and addresses and schedules, and he had them murdered. No. The word tore out of Frank's chest like a dying breath. I didn't know. You knew, Rose cut him off. Maybe not the first one, maybe not the second. But 12 people, Frank? 12 deaths over 16 years, and you never connected the dots. She stood, photograph in hand, Judge Morrison leaving his house on the morning he died. Mickey figured it out. That's why Capone killed him. The cathedral's stained glass windows cast fractured light across the assembled cops, painting their faces in blues and reds and golds that made them look like broken saints. Father Mackenzie had stopped trying to blend into the wall and instead stood frozen at the altar, still clutching his prayer book like a shield against the corruption poisoning his sanctuary. The money, Frank said, desperation making his voice crack. The $500,000. What's it for? Capone reached into his coat again, producing a manila folder thick with documents, payment for services rendered, and a retainer for services yet to come. He tossed the folder toward Commissioner Brady, papers spilling across the marble. Take a look, Commissioner. See how deep this rabbit hole goes. Brady's face went gray as he scanned the documents. Police records, judicial files, political correspondence, all stamped with official seals, all bearing signatures Frank recognized. Mayor Kellerman, Chief Justice Williams, half the city council. This is impossible, Brady whispered. These are forgeries. They have to be. Check the serial numbers, Capone suggested. Cross-reference the dates. Run whatever tests you want. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 16 years ago, Detective Torino made a deal to save his partner's life. What he didn't know was that his partner was already one of mine, had been for months. The words hit Frank like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Mickey. His partner, his friend, the man whose life he'd sold his soul to save, working for Capone all along. Mickey recruited you, Capone continued, savoring Frank's anguish like fine wine. Fed you the warehouse tip. Made sure you'd be there when the shooting started. Made sure you'd have to choose between your duty and his life. He laughed, the sound echoing off stone walls like breaking glass. Amazing what a man will do to save someone he loves. Rose Murphy's hand found her weapon, though whether to arrest Capone or shoot him, Frank couldn't tell. Around them, 300 cops sat in stunned silence, watching their world collapse one revelation at a time. But Mickey grew a conscience, Capone said. Started asking questions, digging into those heart attack deaths, so I gave him one of his own. His smile was winter cruel, poetic justice. Frank closed his eyes and saw Mickey's face from the hospital 16 years ago, grateful, trusting, alive. Built on lies, all of it. Every birthday, every Christmas dinner, every moment of friendship, purchased with betrayal. The truth had finally surfaced, and it was worse than anything Frank had imagined. Frank's legs gave out again, sending him crashing back to his knees on the marble floor. The handcuffs bit into his wrists as he tried to break his fall, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony tearing through his chest. Mickey had been dirty from the beginning. Every memory shifted, tilted, revealed new angles like broken glass catching light. Mickey's convenient patrol route that night, the way he'd known exactly where to position himself in the warehouse, his grateful tears in the hospital bed, not gratitude for salvation, but relief that his cover hadn't been blown. You're lying. The words came out as a sob. Mickey was clean. He was the best cop I ever knew. He was the best actor you ever knew, Capone corrected. Been feeding me information for 8 months before that warehouse job. Police movements, witness locations, evidence schedules. Made himself very valuable to my organization. Rose Murphy knelt beside Frank, her face a mask of professional control barely containing personal devastation. The Morrison evidence. Mickey was the one who logged it into storage. He had access to everything. Frank's world fractured completely. Every case they'd worked together, every late-night stakeout, every moment of brotherhood, all of it poisoned. The man he'd sacrificed his integrity to save had been the enemy from the start. But something changed in your partner, Capone continued. circling Mickey's casket like a predator savoring wounded prey. Started asking the wrong questions about those heart attacks, digging into cases that weren't his business. Giuseppe Castellano's statement was just the beginning. Mickey had compiled a whole file. Commissioner Brady's voice cracked like thin ice. "What kind of file?" Capone reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio, thick with documents. Names, dates, financial records. Mickey had figured out the whole operation. 16 years of careful work, all documented with the precision of a good detective. Frank watched Capone open the portfolio, revealing page after page of Mickey's handwriting. Police reports, bank statements, surveillance photographs, his partner's careful documentation of the corruption network that Frank had unknowingly helped build. Mickey discovered that his old partner wasn't just covering up one warehouse incident, Capone said. Frank here had become quite useful over the years, a trusted detective with access to evidence, witness statements, autopsy reports, someone who could make inconvenient things disappear when necessary. "That's not true," Frank whispered. But even as he spoke, fragments of memory assembled into a damning mosaic, files that had gone missing from his desk, reports he'd been asked to review and never seen again, evidence that had somehow vanished between the crime scene and the courtroom. Rose Murphy pulled one of the scattered photographs closer, studying it with growing horror. The Morrison crime scene. Someone removed evidence before the photographers arrived. She looked up at Frank with eyes that had turned to stone. "You were first on scene. You called in the natural death ruling before the ME even arrived." The cathedral's air had turned thick as cotton, making every breath a struggle. Frank could feel 300 pairs of eyes boring into him, watching the last vestiges of his reputation crumble into dust. "Mickey confronted me last week," Capone continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "Came to my office with his file, his evidence, his righteous anger. Said he couldn't let it continue. Said he'd rather die than watch any more innocent people get fed to my operation." Father Mackenzie made a sound like a dying animal. The old priest pressed his prayer book against his chest as if it could somehow ward off the evil that had invaded his sanctuary. "So I accommodated his wishes," Capone said, his smile sharp as a blade. "Air bubble to the carotid artery. Quick, painless, looks exactly like a heart attack." Mickey never felt a thing. The words hit Frank like bullets, each one punching holes in what remained of his sanity. Mickey hadn't just been murdered. He'd been executed for trying to stop the corruption that Frank had made possible. But then Frank saw something that made his blood freeze. In the scattered documents, partially hidden beneath a crime scene photograph, lay a handwritten note in Mickey's familiar script. Just a few lines, but the words rewrote everything Frank thought he understood. "Frank doesn't know, never knew. They made me recruit him, but he thinks he saved me. He's clean except for that first deal. Been protecting him for 16 years. If something happens to me, make sure he knows the truth. He suffered enough for my sins." "You're wrong about one thing, Capone," Frank said, his voice growing stronger as the truth crystallized. "Mickey didn't grow a conscience. He never lost it. He was trying to protect me." Capone's arrogant smile faltered for the first time. Frank struggled to his feet, chains rattling, but his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. 16 years you thought you owned us both, but Mickey was never really yours. He was playing you, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to bring you down, and the only reason he's dead is because he wouldn't let you destroy anyone else." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Capone's composure finally cracking. Capone's face twisted into something ugly, the mask of civilized control slipping away to reveal the killer underneath. "Like Mickey was some kind of hero?" His voice rose, echoing off the cathedral walls. "Your precious partner fed me information for 16 years. Every raid you planned, every witness you protected, every piece of evidence that could hurt my operations. Mickey made sure it disappeared." "No." Frank clutched Mickey's note against his chest, the paper trembling in his shackled hands. He was gathering evidence, building a case. Everything he did was to protect. "To protect you?" Capone laughed, but the sound held no humor now, only rage. "Frank, you beautiful fool, Mickey wasn't protecting you. He was using you. Every time you looked the other way, every time you let something slide, you were doing his dirty work and mine. Rose Murphy had gone deadly still, her hand hovering over her weapon as she studied the scattered documents. Frank watched her face change as she pieced together connections that had taken Mickey 16 years to unravel. "The evidence lockers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Frank, you had master access. Every piece of evidence that went missing, every witness statement that disappeared, it all traces back through systems you could access." Frank's world tilted sideways. The cathedral floor seemed to shift beneath him, marble becoming quicksand. Mickey handled the paperwork. He said he was streamlining the process, making sure nothing got lost in bureaucracy. "He was making sure the right things got lost," Commissioner Brady said, his voice hollow. He held up a bank statement from the scattered papers, Frank's name clearly visible at the top. "Payments, monthly deposits for 16 years. Money you never saw because it went into an account you never knew existed." The blood drained from Frank's face. "That's impossible. I never opened any account." "Mickey did it for you," Capone said, his composure returning as Frank's world collapsed. "Helpful partner, looking out for your retirement, making sure you were properly compensated for services rendered. You were on my payroll, Detective Torino. Have been since 1931. Father Mackenzie stepped forward from the altar, his aged voice cutting through the mounting chaos. "Enough." The old priest's hands shook, but his voice carried the authority of decades spent confronting sin. "Whatever happened, whoever did what, this is a house of God. There will be no more killing here." Capone's eyes shifted to the priest, and Frank saw something that chilled him to the bone. Recognition. These two men knew each other. "Hello, Father," Capone said softly. "Been a long time since confession, hasn't it?" The priest's face went white as communion wine. "That was sealed, sacred. You promised." "Promises change," Capone cut him off, "especially when priests start asking too many questions about their parishioners' sudden deaths." He reached into his coat again, producing a small vial filled with clear liquid. "Amazing what a man will confess when he thinks death is coming for him. Judge Morrison, for instance, had quite a lot to say about municipal corruption before his heart gave out." Frank's blood turned to ice. "You killed him in confession." "Sacred space," Capone shrugged. "Perfect cover. No witnesses, no questions, no suspicion. Just an old man's heart finally giving out during prayer." His smile was winter cruel. "Father Mackenzie here has been quite helpful over the years. All those last confessions, all those final secrets, very illuminating." The old priest stumbled backward, his prayer book falling to clatter against marble. I didn't know." "Course you knew," Capone said. 12 men over 16 years, all coming to you for last rites before their hearts stopped, all confessing sins that pointed straight back to corruption in the police department, the courts, City Hall." He gestured to the scattered money. "You think I'd pay $500,000 for Frank's cooperation?" Frank's legs gave out completely. He crashed to the cathedral floor, handcuffs scraping against marble, as the full scope of the conspiracy revealed itself. Not just cops and judges and politicians, priests, doctors, medical examiners, the entire system rotted from within. "Mickey figured it out," Frank whispered, clutching the handwritten note like a lifeline. "That's why you killed him." "Mickey figured out part of it," Capone corrected. "Enough to be dangerous. Not enough to stop what's coming next." He looked around the cathedral at 300 cops, his smile returning. "You see, gentlemen, Detective Torino's arrest is just the beginning. That $500,000 isn't payment for past services, it's a retainer for future ones." Deputy Chief Sullivan stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. "You're under arrest, Capone, all of you." Capone's laugh echoed off stained glass windows like breaking crystal. "On what charges, Chief? Attending a funeral? Making a charitable donation?" He gestured to the scattered evidence. "Everything here is perfectly legal. The real question is, how many of your own men are going to walk out of here in handcuffs?" The silence that followed was absolute, and Frank realized with growing horror that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The silence stretched like a held breath, until Frank forced himself to his feet, chains rattling against marble. His legs shook, but his voice carried the weight of 30 years on the force. "You made one mistake, Capone." Frank's words cut through the cathedral air like a blade. Mickey wasn't just gathering evidence against you, he was gathering evidence against everyone. He gestured to the scattered documents with his shackled hands, including himself. Capone's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "The file you're so proud of," Frank continued, strength returning to his voice. "Mickey documented everything. Every payment, every murder, every corrupt cop and judge and politician. But he also documented something else." Frank's eyes found Rose Murphy's, his own confession, written testimony admitting to 16 years of feeding information to organized crime. Signed, witnessed, and filed with Internal Affairs 3 days ago. The color drained from Capone's face. Around the cathedral, 300 cops began to understand what Frank was saying. "Mickey knew you'd kill him," Frank pressed on, "so he made sure his death would mean something. Every dirty cop in this room, every judge on your payroll, every politician taking syndicate money, Mickey named them all, with dates, amounts, and evidence." Commissioner Brady pulled a sealed envelope from his coat, his hands trembling. "This arrived at headquarters yesterday morning. Mickey O'Malley's final report." He looked at Capone with eyes like steel. 47 pages detailing the complete structure of syndicate infiltration into Chicago law enforcement. Capone's composure cracked completely. "That's impossible. Mickey was mine. He wouldn't." "Mickey was never yours," Frank said, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking. "He was undercover. Has been for 16 years. Every piece of information he fed you, every file that disappeared, it was all carefully chosen to build a case against the real corruption in the department." Rose Murphy pulled out her handcuffs, but she wasn't looking at Frank anymore. Her eyes were fixed on Deputy Chief Sullivan, whose face had gone gray as ash. The warehouse raid in 1931. Mickey didn't arrange it to save Frank. He arranged it to expose the cops who were already working for Capone. "No," Sullivan whispered. "You can't prove—" "Mickey could." Rose cut him off. "He documented everything, including which officers received advance warning about raids, which evidence mysteriously disappeared, which cases got buried in bureaucracy." Her voice rose, carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "He spent 16 years documenting the real syndicate infiltration of the Chicago Police Department." Father Mackenzie stepped forward, his aged hands steady now despite everything. "Michael came to confession last week. Not to confess his sins, but to confess his fear. He said he'd lived a lie for 16 years to protect the truth, said he'd rather die honest than live corrupted." Capone's rage exploded like breaking glass. "Mickey O'Malley was a criminal. He fed me information. He took my money." "He took your money and documented every payment," Frank said. "He fed you information and kept copies of everything he shared. He gained your trust so he could destroy your organization from the inside." Frank's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Mickey wasn't your asset. You were his." The cathedral fell silent, except for the sound of Capone's breathing, harsh and ragged. 16 years of careful planning, 16 years of believing he owned half the police department, and it had all been an elaborate trap set by one honest cop willing to sacrifice his reputation for justice. $500,000, Rose said, pieces falling into place. "You brought it here to pay off your network of corrupt cops, but Mickey's confession names them all. The money isn't payment, it's evidence." Commissioner Brady nodded to the officers positioned at every exit. "Gentlemen, you know who you are. Mickey O'Malley's report is very thorough, very specific. You can surrender now, or we can do this the hard way." 12 cops throughout the cathedral slowly raised their hands. 12 men who'd sold their badges for syndicate money, now exposed by the partner they thought they'd corrupted. Capone looked around the cathedral at his crumbling empire, at the honest cops moving to arrest his network, at the evidence scattered across marble that would send him to prison for life. His legendary control finally shattered completely. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the words sounded hollow in the sacred space. "Yes, it is," Frank said quietly. He looked at Mickey's casket, understanding finally flooding through him. "Mickey saved us all. He saved me 16 years ago, and he saved the entire department this week. The only difference is, this time I understand what he sacrificed to do it." Rose Murphy approached Frank with keys for his handcuffs. "Mickey's confession cleared you, Frank. You were never part of the real corruption. You were just the bait Mickey used to catch the actual criminals." As the shackles fell away from his wrists, Frank knelt beside his partner's casket one last time. "I'm sorry I doubted you, Mickey. You were always the better cop." Outside, sirens wailed as federal agents arrived to collect Capone and his money. But inside St. Mary's Cathedral, 30 years of lies had finally given way to truth. 3 months later, Frank Torino stood in the same spot where Mickey's casket had rested, but St. Mary's Cathedral felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the truth had burned away something poisonous that had been festering in the sacred space. The afternoon sun streamed through stained glass windows, painting the marble floor in blues and golds instead of the harsh shadows he remembered from that terrible day. The cathedral was empty except for Father Mackenzie, who knelt at the altar in prayer. The old priest had aged a decade in 3 months, his hair gone completely white, his hands more fragile than autumn leaves. But his voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of genuine absolution. "He knew," Father Mackenzie said without turning around. "Mickey knew what it would cost him. Came to me the night before he died, not for confession but for blessing. Said he'd carried the lie as long as he could bear." Frank approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. "How long did you know about the investigation?" 16 years. The priest's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mickey told me everything after the warehouse raid. Said he needed someone to witness his choice, someone who could speak for him if the truth ever needed telling." Father Mackenzie finally turned, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "He made me promise not to intervene, no matter what happened. Said the only way to catch them all was to let them think they'd won." Frank nodded, understanding flooding through him like grace. Mickey had orchestrated everything, including his own martyrdom, to save a police department that had been rotting from within. The warehouse raid in 1931 hadn't been about saving Frank's life. It had been about positioning Frank as the perfect unwitting bait for a 16-year investigation. "The hardest part," Father Mackenzie continued, "was watching you suffer, watching you blame yourself for choices that were never yours to make. Mickey said that was the price of justice. Someone innocent always paid for someone else's sins." Outside the cathedral, Chicago had begun to heal. Capone was awaiting trial in federal custody, facing charges that would ensure he never saw freedom again. The 12 corrupt cops Mickey had identified were either in prison or had fled the city. Commissioner Brady had implemented reforms that Mickey had secretly designed years earlier, turning the Chicago Police Department into something approaching the ideal Mickey had died protecting. But Frank carried different scars now, not the guilt he'd borne for 30 years, but something heavier and more complex. The knowledge that his best friend had sacrificed everything, his reputation, his life, his peace, to save Frank's soul and the soul of the department they both loved. Rose Murphy found him there an hour later, her footsteps soft against marble. She'd been promoted to detective sergeant, Mickey's final recommendation discovered among his papers, along with a detailed plan for departmental restructuring. She carried a manila folder and wore the expression of someone bearing necessary burdens. "His pension," she said, placing the folder on the pew beside Frank. "Fully restored, with commendations for 16 years of undercover service. His widow will receive full benefits, and the department is naming the Academy's ethics training program after him." Frank opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside, Mickey's service record had been rewritten to reflect the truth. 16 years of exemplary service, 16 years of sacrifice for the greater good, 16 years of walking through hell to emerge with his integrity intact. "There's something else," Rose said gently. "A letter. Mickey left it with Internal Affairs to be delivered only if the investigation succeeded." She handed Frank a sealed envelope bearing his name in Mickey's familiar handwriting. Frank's hands shook as he broke the seal and unfolded pages that felt heavier than stone. "Frank, if you're reading this, it means I'm dead and you finally know the truth. I'm sorry for the lies, but not sorry for the choice. You saved my life that night in 1931, and I spent 16 years trying to save yours in return. You were never corrupt, partner. Never dirty, never compromised, never anything but the honest cop I first met in 1929. They tried to use you, but I made sure they could never truly touch you. Every piece of evidence you thought you'd help disappear, I kept copies. Every favor you thought you'd done for them, I documented. You were clean, Frank. You were always clean. The guilt you've carried all these years, that was mine to bear, not yours. I chose to make that deal with Capone. I chose to play the long game. I chose to sacrifice my reputation to save our department. You saved me once, and I spent the rest of my life saving everyone else. Don't mourn me, partner. I got to die honest. That's more than most men in our line of work can say. Your friend always, Mickey. Frank folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, next to his heart. Around him, the cathedral settled into late afternoon silence, and for the first time in 30 years, Frank Torino felt something approaching peace. He'd spent 3 decades carrying guilt that had never been his to bear. Now he would spend whatever time remained carrying the weight of Mickey's sacrifice, and somehow that felt like honor instead of burden. Outside, Chicago waited under an autumn sky, and Frank walked toward it with steady steps.